Okay, for those of you joining us on the recorded session, welcome to week 11 US History Seminar. I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share now. As I start this, I want to let folks know I have several video clips in this. Speaking of which, I want to make sure that I set it to optimize those. I have several video clips in this presentation. If you're on the recorded session and I come to one of those and like the screen blacks out or something, or it skips ahead and it doesn't show a video, I will put links to those in the course. If sometimes if I put these in there, YouTube flags the video. Sometimes it just demonetizes the video, which is fine. I don't make any money off of these videos. But occasionally the copyright holders have a real problem with me including video clips in my presentations that I make into videos. So if that happens, I will endeavor to put up links to those individual videos in the course just right underneath this one. All right, there we go. So this week's announcements, you should now be working on Unit 4 reading guide. This is due on the 30th. I give you lots of time on these so that you can break the work up and do a good job on it. I don't give you multiple weeks so that you can not do anything for 2 3/4 weeks and then slop together a bunch of crap and turn it in. That's not why you have that much time. Believe me, it's so much easier if you take your time and do a little bit every day and do a good job than stressfully trying to slop together a bunch of stuff at the last minute. Just trust me on that. Make sure as you're doing that, most of you are already doing this, but just as a reminder, make your text on the reading guide different. Make what you add bold or underline it or make it a different color. Dark colors, please. People have tried making it like yellow, and oh, that's very hard for me to read. Remember, I'm old. But yeah, you certainly don't have to retype the reading guide. I've had a couple people that print it off and then type it from scratch. Good gravy. Make a copy of it and just add text. Don't reinvent the wheel, but please leave the questions in there. That really helps me as I go through it. End of grace period for Unit 3 test was yesterday, so hopefully you got it done. I do have that completion data in PowerSchool. If you didn't do the essay questions, your score is in PowerSchool, along with an annotation that you did not do the essay questions, and that's why your score is low. Remember, the big essay question on every test is based on what we learn in these live seminar sessions. The number of people that don't do the seminar work and then just skip those essay questions just absolutely blows me away. Yeah, hopefully if you're watching this, you're not doing that. Don't forget to do the week 11 discussion forum. A quick word about timing. You should be getting on early in the week and doing at least your response to the prompt. Okay, if you want to wait a little bit to do your replies to what other people post, that's fine. But it's not fair if for folks that do get on and do their initial post early in the week to have to sit there and twiddle their thumbs waiting for other people to come do their initial posts because those other people have decided, oh, I'm going to wait until Friday at 7:45 p.m. to hop on and do my discussion forum because I'm just checking a box. I will say with remote learning and online learning, you're going to get as much out of it as you put into it. And some of you are literally doing just the bare minimum possible. And as such, you're not understanding anything and you're not getting a lot out of the experience. Don't forget to do the seminar work, the news quiz, and the seminar journal that you'll get the topic for at the end of this. Lots of people skip that, and it's just hurting you. When you don't turn in work, you're not offending me. Okay, I don't view that as a personal attack, so if that's the idea, if the whole thing is, oh, I'm going to show Rosenleaf I'm not going to do his damn work, you're only hurting you. You're not hurting me at all. It means I have less stuff to grade. All I do is give you a 0. At the end of the semester, you don't do enough, you fail, and you have to take the class again, either in summer school or again in, next spring, wherein you will be a senior in a junior class, which I will tell you is not comfortable. And incidentally, if you're a CMR student, I teach at CMR most years, and I will be again next year. You're going to get a lot of the same stuff next year that you get this year. I don't update my act very much. So, yeah, may as well pass now. Again, please join the Remind. If you're not on the Remind, you're missing stuff. Get on the Remind, join the Remind, instructions in the course. And last but not least, I will be posting an extra credit opportunity next week. It will be something that I would call experiential. So it's something that I'm asking you to do sort of extra to experience. I haven't decided. If you were with me first semester, you might remember that the extra credit that I offered was you could do virtual museum visits. I haven't decided what that's going to look like this semester. I would like not to do the same thing if I can help it. So I'm still formulating that, but I will have that in the course next week, so you have some time to do that before the end of the semester. I will probably make that due like the week before finals week is what I'm thinking. So there we go. And I'll have more details about that next week. Any questions about anything that I just mentioned in the announcements? Going once, going twice. All right. All right, so we're talking about JFK this week, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and a little bit of an introduction into the 1960s. Kennedy was the first president of the 1960s, technically. I mean, Eisenhower served until early 1961, but Eisenhower was definitely the president of the 1950s. And so Kennedy represented very much a change in direction for the country, a generational change, certainly. And he was just a different style of leader. So election of 1960, either way America chose in this race, it was going to be a generational change. Up to this point, presidents had been really from a different generation. Really the generation that had, in one way or another, gotten us involved in World War II. Eisenhower was, granted, he fought in World War II. He was a general, but he was a general. He was one of the leaders. Both Kennedy and his opponent, Richard Milhous Nixon, had been actual soldiers in World War II. They had been, seen actual combat fighting, whereas Eisenhower, as a general, really, he was not on the front lines or anything like that. Harry Truman had fought in World War One. Obviously, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not out there, storming trenches or anything like that. He was in a wheelchair. So this was a generational change. These two guys had come of age really in the period before the war. had fought in the war, and now were running for president. They had actually come to Congress the same year, 1946. Nixon had been elected a congressman from California, and Kennedy had been elected a congressman from Massachusetts. They had both served on the House Labor Committee together. So very, very interesting. Nixon chose as his running mate, he was the Republican candidate, the Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. The idea here from Nixon was that Lodge was very well thought of, and that maybe if he chose somebody from Kennedy's home state, that Kennedy would have to spend a bunch of time and resources defending his home state. So that was kind of his idea. Incidentally, spoiler alert, ain't gonna make any difference. Kennedy was the candidate of the Democratic Party. Again, much younger, and his running mate was an older gentleman, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson of the state of Texas. Johnson was actually, I mean, technically, Kennedy's boss in the Senate. Johnson was the Senate Majority Leader, which is one of the most important and powerful positions in the legislative branch of government. The Senate Majority Leader sets the agenda for the U.S. Senate. He or she one day leads the majority party, and the majority party really rules the U.S. Senate to a large degree. A little less so today with the filibuster. Not that they didn't have the filibuster back then, but it was different. So Johnson actually was taking very much a power cut when, spoiler alert, Kennedy's going to win and Johnson's going to become vice president. Johnson really takes a power cut. The vice presidency is not nearly as powerful as the Senate Majority Leader, except the fact that you're next in line to be president. By the way, when Johnson resigned his Senate seat and resigned as Senate Majority Leader, the person who replaced Johnson as Senate Majority Leader was Montana Senator Mike Mansfield. You might know that name. The Mansfield Center for the Performing Arts downtown is named after Mike Mansfield. If you are a University of Montana fan, and if you've ever been on that campus, the library is named after Senator Mansfield and his wife. So yeah, lots of stuff in Montana named after Mansfield. We still know the name Mansfield. Mansfield ends up being, I believe, the longest serving Senate Majority Leader in the history of the country, and eventually will become ambassador to Japan later on. So again, this represents a generational shift regardless of the outcome. Both of these guys, they weren't the exact same age, but they were really close in age. They were both World War II combat veterans. This was also the first presidential campaign that featured a televised presidential debate. So television was still a very new invention and had not been really used in presidential politics before this. And now for the first time, the two candidates will meet face to face, basically, on television. And I have just a little bit of that debate to show you.
Thank you, Mr. Nixon. That completes the opening statements, and now the candidates will answer questions or comment upon one another's answers to questions put by correspondents of the networks. The correspondents.
I'm Sander Van Oker, NBC News.
I'm Charles Warren, Mutual News.
Our modern debates are a lot
Stuart Novin, CBS News.
Bob
from
Fleming,
production
ABC
value
News.
standpoint.
The first question to Senator Kennedy from Mr. Fleming.
Senator, the Vice President in his campaign has said that you are naive and at times immature. He has raised the question of leadership. On this issue, why do you think people should vote for you rather than the Vice President?
Well, the Vice President and I came to the Congress together, 1946. We both served in the Labor Committee. I've been there now for 14 years, the same period of time that he has, so that our experience in government is comparable. Secondly, I think the question is, what are the programs that we advocate? what is the party record that we lead? I come out of the Democratic Party, which in this century has produced Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, and which supported and sustained these programs which I've discussed tonight. Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it. And it is a fact that through most of these last 25 years, the Republican leadership has opposed federal aid for education, medical care for the aged, development of the Tennessee Valley, development of our natural resources. I think Mr. Nixon is an effective leader of his party. I hope he would grant me the same. The question before us is, which point of view and which party do we want to lead the United States?
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
The next question to Vice President Nixon from Mr. Van-Ocker.
Mr. Vice President, since the question of executive leadership is a very important campaign issue, I'd like to follow Mr. Noven's question. Now, Republican campaign slogans, you'll see them on signs around the country as we did last week, say, "It's experience that counts." That's over a picture of yourself, sir. Implying that you've had more governmental executive decision-making experience than your opponent. Now, in his news conference on August 24th, President Eisenhower was asked to give one example of a major idea of yours that he adopted. His reply was, and I'm quoting, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Now, that was a month ago, sir, and the President hasn't brought it up since. And I'm wondering, sir, if you can clarify which version is correct, the one put out by Republican campaign leaders or the one put out by President Eisenhower?
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Van-Ocker, that if you know the President, that was probably a facetious remark. I would also suggest that insofar as his statement is concerned, that I think it would be improper for the President of the United States to disclose the instances in which members of his official family had made recommendations, as I have made them through the years, to him which he has accepted or rejected. The President has always maintained, and very properly so, that he is entitled to get what advice he wants from his cabinet and from his other advisors without disclosing that to anybody, including, as a matter of fact, the Congress. Now,
Okay, well, we'll stop it there. It goes on for a while. You notice that if you watched like the debates between current President Biden and former President Trump, or any of our modern presidential debates, they were very different back then. Nowadays, there's 30-second time limits and 45-second time limits, and it's all very sound bitey. This was a lot more free exchange of idea kind of thing. You might have noticed that Nixon, for that first debate, was not very well made up. Nixon refused to wear makeup, and it showed. He had some sweat. He was kind of a sweaty guy, and so sweat on his lip caused a lot of people to think that were watching the debate that he was very nervous. Those that watched the debate on TV, a majority of them said that Kennedy won the debate. The majority of people that listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon won the debate. So, power of television. And again, this Kennedy was going to win this election. You will notice that he very narrowly wins the popular vote, and that neither candidate gets a majority of the popular vote. Nobody gets over 50%. Kennedy gets 49.7, Nixon gets 49.6. And then it's a little bit more cut and dry in the Electoral College, but very, very narrow. There was a thought that Nixon could have challenged the results of this. It all actually came down to Illinois. And but Nixon decided that in order to preserve his own political future, that he would not attempt to challenge the results of this debate or of this election, that would make him look bad and that nobody would support him after that. Funny how things change. So yeah, you can see how this went. Incidentally, from how our modern elections go, you'll notice that California went for Nixon. Nixon was from California. So that's a big and California back then was a lot more Republican than it is today. And notice Texas went for the Democrats, which really never happens today. So things very different. So Kennedy's program, or rather his kind of talking, his slogan for the campaign, if you will, was the New Frontier. And this came to sort of kind of like Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, except that really Kennedy didn't have any specific proposals that fell under the New Frontier, but Kennedy's agenda came to be known as the New Frontier. And I'm just going to play you just a short bit of the speech where he talks just a little bit about this, which is it was actually a major theme of his acceptance of the Democratic Convention, of the Democratic nomination. But I'll just play you just a little bit of this.
It is time, in short, for a new generation of leadership. All over the world, particularly in the newer nations, young men are coming to power. Men who are not bound by the traditions of the past. Men who are not blinded by the old fears and hate and rivalries. Young men who can cast off the old slogans and the old delusions. For I stand here tonight facing west on what was once the last frontier. From the lands that stretch 3,000 miles behind us, the pioneers gave up their safety, their comfort, and sometimes their lives to build our new West. They were determined to make the new world strong and free, an example to the world, to overcome its hazards and its hardships, to conquer the enemies that threatened from within and out. And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, the frontier of unfilled hopes and unfilled threats. It is a set of challenges. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here, whether we seek it or not. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered province of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus.
Yeah. So Kennedy had an ambitious agenda that largely he doesn't really accomplish. His successor will actually accomplish a lot more of it, because Kennedy was not nearly the skillful salesperson that Lyndon Johnson was, and Lyndon knew how to play the game in Congress and get things through Congress, and Kennedy was not as good at that. So Kennedy was inaugurated in 1961. The Kennedy administration is often referred to as Camelot. It was seen as this sort of idealized time with this handsome young president and his beautiful wife, whose name was Jackie. And that name comes from, there was a Broadway musical that came out around this time that was called Camelot. And the people really identify the Kennedy administration with that musical. During the Kennedy administration, you saw heightened Cold War tensions, things like the Second Berlin Crisis. So the first Berlin crisis involved the Berlin airlift. This second one involved the Soviets demanding that the Americans, the British, and the French leave West Berlin. Remember, Berlin was in the middle of the Soviet zone and was at this point a completely separate country from West Germany. East Germany was separate from West Germany, but this little part of Berlin was also part of West Germany and was controlled by the Americans, the British, and the French. And the Soviets attempted to force the Americans, the British, and the French out. And this led to actual like American tanks and Soviet tanks, like almost nose to nose in the streets of Berlin. And it was after the Soviets backed down that they and the East Germans will build the Berlin Wall to keep the East Germans and the East Berliners in the East, because at this point, if you could get across into the West, you could leave East Germany behind, which was a very restrictive system, and go and live in the West. And lots of, like, thousands of people were doing that, and the East Germans were just losing tons of people. And so they built a wall to keep their own citizens in. And that wall stood from the 60s to the late 1980s. Also, during the Kennedy administration, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy had inherited an attempt to take out the Cuban communist dictator Fidel Castro from the Eisenhower administration. So the Eisenhower administration had come up with this plan to train a bunch of people that had been kicked out of Cuba to go reinvade Cuba. And so Kennedy agreed to this plan, and they were training these guys. And on the day they were supposed to invade, Kennedy was supposed to approve Air Force support for those brigades to go and reinvade Cuba. Well, at the last minute, Kennedy decided, this is a bad idea. And he doesn't approve the air support. And so these Cubans that the CIA had trained just basically gets completely slaughtered at the Bay of Pigs. And that looks really bad for the United States. And then about a year after that, it's discovered that the Soviets were putting short and intermediate range nuclear missiles into sites in Cuba. And remember, Cuba's about 30 miles off the coast of Florida. The missiles that were there or were under construction could hit anywhere in the continental United States, with the exception of maybe Seattle. So this was a major threat. The Kennedy administration was also seeking to avoid a direct military confrontation, because they knew that if they, tried to, say, invade Cuba, that the Soviets would then launch attacks and we'd be at war with nuclear weapons. So ultimately, there was a blockade to keep more missiles from coming in, and the two sides actually negotiated through, of all people, Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, was the primary negotiator with the Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. They had a relationship, and they negotiated the end to this. So ultimately, no military action was taken, and this was the closest the two sides ever came to nuclear war. It was during the Kennedy administration that American involvement in Vietnam expanded. There had been combat advisors there since the Eisenhower years, when the French were defeated and left their former colony. And Kennedy will send in more advisors, but again, they were just advisors. It's actually under Lyndon Johnson that the United States actually begins formally fighting in Vietnam. And then finally, the space race between the Soviets and the Americans heats up. The Soviet rocket program was well advanced from the American rocket program. The Soviets had already launched Sputnik, which was an unmanned satellite that was orbiting the Earth during the Eisenhower years, which caused America to completely freak out. They were the first ones to launch a living thing into space. They launched a dog named Laika into space. They launched monkeys into space. They were the first one to launch a person into space and return him safely to the Earth. Yuri Gagarin was his name. They were the first to launch a woman into space. Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. So the Soviet space program was well ahead of the American space program, and Kennedy challenged America to basically overtake the Soviets, and ultimately that was successful. But a lot of the domestic things Kennedy wanted to do didn't end up happening until after Kennedy died. Lyndon Johnson sort of rolled them into his program, which was the Great Society. Kennedy ended up being a supporter of civil rights. At the beginning, he was not. Remember, at this point, the Democratic Party was very split. The Northern Democrats were very supportive of civil rights, but a lot of their political power came from the South. And the Southern Democrats were very much opposed to any expansion of civil rights. And so Kennedy was trying to kind of walk this tightrope of, on the one hand, appealing to Northern liberals, and on the other hand, still appealing to more conservative Southerners and trying to keep them in the same party. But ultimately, Kennedy and his brother Robert will show great deals of support for the civil rights movement. The other thing to bear in mind is that Kennedy had a little bit of nepotism going on in his administration. His attorney general was his brother, Robert Kennedy, who probably would not have been attorney general had his brother not been president. Not that Robert was not brilliant and hardworking and very capable, but he was also quite young. Even Kennedy's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, was put in charge of one of Kennedy's signature programs, the Peace Corps, sending young Americans overseas to help developing nations with crops and things like that, basically service program. And Sergeant Shriver was put in charge of that. And again, not that Sergeant Shriver was not brilliant and hardworking and all of these things, but probably would not have been head of anything like the Peace Corps had John F. Kennedy not been his brother-in-law. This is just a picture of American and Soviet tanks almost nose to nose in Berlin in 1961. So Kennedy, I think this is the space. Yeah, when Kennedy proposed that America do more in space, he gave a speech at Rice University that sort of laid this out. I'm just going to play you a little snippet.
If I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to understand, when Kennedy proposed this, the American space program was like rockets falling over on the launch pad bad. We were barely kind of keeping up with the Soviets, but America was significantly behind. Kennedy may as well have said, "We shall build a magical wardrobe to take us to Narnia." I mean, that's the kind of crazy this was. We're going to send a man to the moon and return him and his crewmates to the Earth. Yeah, and they just barely do it. They just barely make it. Summer of 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon. Kennedy didn't live to see it, but he was the president that challenged Americans to get this done. And obviously Kennedy, and you may be aware of this, had an interesting personal life. He was the second born son of the Kennedy family. The first one was Joseph Sr., Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. The Kennedys were the sons of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., and Joe Sr. was the American ambassador to Britain right before World War II, and was one of the architects of the Munich Agreement that actually helped start World War II and was vaguely pro-Nazi. So when he was kind of discredited and forced to come back to the United States, his political career, Joe's, was over, and he chose to focus on his kids, specifically his son, Joe Jr. Well, in World War II, Joe Jr. was an American bomber pilot, and he was shot down over Germany. And so all of that attention now fell to the second son, John, or Jack. And so he was now the one that needed to, because Joe Sr. wanted to make one of his sons president of the United States. In addition to this, by the way, Joe Sr. ended up having a stroke and living the rest of his life without the ability to speak. He could, shortly after John was elected president, he had a stroke and he lost the power to speak. Kennedy's wife had a stillbirth and a miscarriage in the 1950s. They had 2 kids and a third that died at 2 days old in 1963, not too long before his assassination. Kennedy had a myriad of health issues. He had fevers, stomach issues, colon issues, intestine issues, abscesses, and later on it was discovered Addison's disease. So Kennedy was actually, despite the fact that he was seen as this very vibrant, healthy guy playing touch football, this whole 9 yards, he was sicker than a dog. They actually reinstalled the wheelchair ramps that FDR had in the White House because Kennedy was in a wheelchair for significant portions of time. I mean, he could get up and move, but it was very, very painful, horrible back issues. So he was very, very sick. Before he became president, he actually almost died of scarlet fever. Like the priest delivered the last rites. That's how sick he was. And of course, you probably know Kennedy had numerous affairs before he became president, and it's believed while he was president. He frequently went skinny dipping in the White House pool with women that were not his wife. Here he is with the entertainer Marilyn Monroe shortly after she serenaded him at a birthday party with "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." And there you go. That's your nightmare fuel for tonight, is me singing that. So yeah, very, very complicated personal life that I felt that I should bring up. So Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, November 22nd, 1963 to be exact. He was in Dallas as part of his re-election campaign. So this was a little less than a year before the election of 1964. Kennedy was not particularly popular in Texas. Again, the Northern and Southern Democratic parties were very much straining, and within that next decade, they are going to basically pretty much split, and a lot of Southern Democrats are going to become Republicans. So, yeah, there was a lot of tension here. But Kennedy arrived in Dallas and went on a tour of the city and was riding through downtown Dallas through an area called Dealey Plaza when shots rang out, and he was shot. A former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the crime, but before he could go on trial, he was killed by a gentleman by the name of Jack Ruby. So Kennedy died and Lyndon Johnson became president. He was sworn in. He was actually there. He was in the next car, and he takes the oath of office before leaving Dallas. I have just a quick video clip. There was a guy with a home movie camera right next to where Kennedy was shot, and he captured it on film. This is known as the Zapruder film. This one has been slightly edited to try and keep Kennedy in the center of the frame a little bit. I'm sorry, it takes it just a second to start, and there's no sound on this at all. Come on. There we go. So here's Kennedy's car. After this, no president really rode in open-top limousines anymore. And there you see he's grabbed his throat. The bullet went through his throat, and then right about there is the headshot that ultimately kills him. So, yeah. Again, Oswald, the official investigation of this ruled that Oswald had acted alone. Most people believe that was probably baloney. There was no way with the rifle that Oswald had and that had used to get 3 shots off that quickly, especially when the first shot completely missed entirely. So it's believed that there was probably a second shooter somewhere. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too far. But yeah, so regardless, Kennedy is laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. They start an eternal flame that was lit at his funeral. In about 1968, a more permanent flame is put in, which is the one you see here. And aside from at one point during the early 2000s, they changed out the mechanism, but they did keep a flame going. That has been burning there since 1963. Kennedy's wife, Jacqueline, who had remarried after Kennedy was assassinated several years later, she is buried next to John F. Kennedy in Arlington as his wife. So yeah, there you go. So that's that. So your journal topic for this week: why do you think is the memory of President Kennedy so beloved today? Kennedy was a fairly controversial president at the time, but nowadays most people go, oh, Kennedy was wonderful. Why is that, do you think? So there you go. Are there any questions about anything we talked about today? I see nothing in the chat. All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to let you be free. If you have something you need to talk to me about, hang out and we'll discuss it.